Sometimes the loneliest souls are the ones most worth knowing. Sometimes the people we fear the most are just carrying too much pain to let anyone close. Up near Cold Pine Ridge, they talked about the woman who lived alone past Widow's Creek. For 20 years, she hadn't come to town. Folks said she was cursed. No man dared visit her cabin up that mountain trail. Elias Cross was an aging lawman looking to retire. He had his own ghosts and his own pain. When he rode into that mountain town, people warned him to stay away from her. But Elias found a child's locket in the snow, and something called him up that lonely trail. What he found wasn't a witch. It was a woman with sad eyes and trembling hands. She'd been hiding something for 20 years. Something that could change everything. What dark secret had kept her alone all this time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver locket felt cold against Elias Cross's weathered palm as he stood in the doorway of Murphy's Inn, watching the morning mist roll down from Cold Pine Ridge like ghostly fingers reaching for the valley below. The mountain town of Millhaven stretched before him, a collection of weathered buildings that had seen better decades, their paint peeling like old scabs, their foundations settling deeper into the rocky soil with each passing winter. He'd been carrying that badge for 37 years. And now it sat heavy in his vest pocket, no longer pinned to his chest. Sheriff Elias Cross had become simply Elias Cross, a man with graying temples and lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises and watching too many good men die. The badge, worn smooth from decades of handling, had been his identity, his purpose, his burden. Now, at 58, he felt unmoored without it. Like a ship cut loose from its anchor. You sure you don't want to reconsider, Sheriff? Murphy wiped his hands on a stained apron, his Irish accent still thick after 20 years in these mountains. That woman up there, she ain't natural. Been living alone since before most folks can remember. Some say she killed the Barkley boy with her bare hands. Elias turned the locket over in his fingers, feeling the delicate engravings worn smooth by time. Inside, he'd found a tiny daguerreotype of a child, a little girl with solemn eyes and carefully braided hair. On the back, someone had etched the name Mary Catherine in spidery script. What exactly happened to this Barkley boy? Elias asked, settling his long frame into a chair near the window. His knees protested, old injuries from a fall off his horse chasing rustlers near the Mexican border 15 years back. Everything ached these days, reminders of a life spent in service to the law. Murphy's face darkened. Tommy Barkley. Sweet kid, maybe 12 years old. His mama sent him up the mountain to gather kindling one autumn morning. That was 23 years ago, come October. Never came home. He crossed himself quickly. They found his hat near Widow's Creek, all torn up and bloody. Search parties combed those mountains for weeks. Never found hide nor hair of the boy himself. And folks think the mountain woman killed him. What else could it be? She was new then, just moved up there after some trouble down in Denver. Kept to herself, but Tommy was curious about everything. Always asking questions, always poking around where he shouldn't. Week after he disappeared, old Henrik saw her burning something behind her cabin. Clothes, it looked like. Children's clothes. Elias sipped his coffee, bitter and strong enough to wake the dead. Through the window, he could see the mountain trail winding upward through stands of pine and aspen, disappearing into shadows and mist. Something about that lonely path called to him, the same way the locket had called to him when he'd spotted it half buried in the snow behind the livery stable. You served long? Murphy asked, nodding toward the badge outline visible through Elias's vest pocket. Started as a deputy in Kansas when I was barely 21. Worked my way up through territories from Colorado to Arizona. Saw plenty of violence, plenty of folks who'd lost their way. He paused, thinking of Martha, sweet Martha, who'd waited for him through 7 years of courtship before finally accepting that a lawman's wife would always come second to duty. She'd married the banker's son instead, and Elias had thrown himself deeper into his work to forget the ache. Then why come here? Why not somewhere civilized with proper law and order? Elias smiled ruefully. Maybe I've had enough of proper law and order. Maybe I need to find out what peace looks like. Murphy shook his head. You won't find peace up that mountain. That woman, she's got the devil in her. Practices witchcraft, they say. Talks to spirits. Old Mrs. Henderson swears she's seen her dancing naked under the full moon, calling down curses on the town. Mrs. Henderson see this with her own eyes? Well, no, but her cousin's boy, second-hand stories and gossip. Elias stood, his joints creaking like old leather. I've heard enough hearsay in my time to know the difference between fact and fear. Outside, the October air carried the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Elias walked the main street, noting how conversations stopped when he passed, how curtains twitched in windows, how children were quickly called inside. Word had spread fast about the retired lawman asking questions about the mountain woman. At the general store, Mrs. Kowalski, a stout woman with flour permanently embedded under her fingernails, refused to meet his eyes as she wrapped his supplies. You planning to winter here in town? She asked, her Polish accent making the words musical despite her obvious unease. Haven't decided yet. Might explore the area first, see what's up in those mountains? Her hands stilled on the brown paper. Nothing up there but trouble, mister. That woman, she ain't like normal folk. My husband, he delivered supplies to her cabin once, maybe 10 years back. Said she answered the door holding a rifle like she knew how to use it. Had wild hair and wild eyes, and she spoke in whispers, like she was afraid her own voice might wake something terrible. Did she threaten your husband? Didn't need to. He could feel the wrongness coming off her like heat from a forge. Paid him exact change and shut the door without a word of thanks. Never asked for another delivery. Elias purchased bacon, coffee, hardtack, and a small sack of flour. As Mrs. Kowalski counted out his change, she leaned forward conspiratorially. You want my advice? Find yourself a nice room at Murphy's and forget about that mountain. There's other places a man can find peace. Places that won't cost him his soul. The afternoon sun slanted long across the valley as Elias prepared his gear. His horse, a steady bay gelding named Judge, seemed unbothered by the local superstitions. Judge had carried him through Apache territory and outlaw country without flinching. Whatever waited up that mountain trail couldn't be worse than what they'd already survived together. Dr. Brennan, the town's physician, stopped by the livery stable as Elias was checking his saddle. Heard you're planning a ride up the mountain. Word travels fast in a small town. Too fast. Sometimes. Brennan was a thin man with kind eyes and steady hands that had sutured more bullet wounds than birth cuts. I've been thinking about what Murphy told you. About the Barkley boy. You know something different? Brennan glanced around, making sure they were alone. Tommy Barkley was a good kid, but he was also reckless. Loved to explore, never met a cave he wouldn't crawl into or a cliff he wouldn't climb. The mountains are dangerous, Sheriff. Plenty of ways for a curious boy to get himself killed without any help from mountain women, but the bloody clothes. I examined that hat personally. Could have been animal blood. Could have been from Tommy himself if he took a fall. Point is, we never found a body. Without a body, how can we be sure what really happened? Elias adjusted Judge's bridle, thinking, what's your professional opinion of this woman? I've never met her. But I'll tell you this, in 30 years of practicing medicine, I've learned that people who live in isolation usually have good reasons. Sometimes they're running from something, sometimes they're protecting something, and sometimes they're just tired of being hurt by folks who should know better. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elias mounted Judge and turned toward the mountain trail. The locket rested in his shirt pocket close to his heart, and he found himself wondering about the little girl in the photograph. Mary Catherine. Who was she? Why had someone kept her image in such a precious thing, only to lose it in the snow? The trail began easily enough, winding through meadows dotted with late-season wildflowers. But as it climbed higher, the path grew narrow and treacherous, carved into the mountainside by weather and wildlife rather than human hands. Pine branches closed overhead, filtering the dying light into scattered golden coins. Judge's hooves found purchase on the rocky trail with the confidence of a mountain-bred horse. though Elias could feel the animal's tension increase with each switchback that took them higher into the thin air. His own breathing grew labored, not from exertion, but from a growing sense that they were being watched. Twice he stopped, scanning the timber for movement. Twice he saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. But the feeling persisted, prickling along his neck like cold fingers. The trail leveled out into a small clearing, just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Ahead, perhaps 100 yards through the trees, a thin column of smoke rose straight up in the still air. Lamplight flickered yellow in a single window. Elias dismounted and led Judge forward on foot, his boots crunching softly on fallen leaves. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like something from a fairy tale, small but well built, with a stone chimney and carefully chinked logs. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, stretched along one side. Firewood was stacked neat and high under a lean-to shelter. This wasn't the hovel of a madwoman. This was the home of someone who planned ahead, who took care of things, who understood the rhythm of mountain seasons. He was still 50 yards from the cabin when a voice cut through the darkness. Clear and firm and distinctly female. "That's close enough, stranger. State your business or move along." Elias stopped, hands visible and empty. "My name is Elias Cross. I found something that might belong to you." A long silence. "Then I don't lose things. A locket, silver, has a little girl's picture inside." Another silence, longer this time. When the voice came again, it carried a different quality. Surprise, perhaps, or pain. "Where did you find it?" "In the snow behind the livery stable in town." "That's not possible. I have it right here. Maybe we could talk about it in person?" The cabin door opened slowly, revealing a slender figure silhouetted against the lamplight. Even from this distance, Elias could see she held a rifle with practiced ease. "Put it on that stump there and back away. If it's what you say it is, I'll know." Elias did as she asked, placing the locket carefully on a weathered tree stump before retreating to where Judge waited patiently. The woman emerged from her cabin, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating rough terrain in darkness. She approached the stump cautiously, the rifle never wavering from its ready position. When she reached the locket, she set the rifle aside and picked up the small silver object with hands that trembled despite her obvious efforts at control. She opened it, and even from 30 yards away, Elias heard her sharp intake of breath. For a long moment she stood frozen. Then she sank to her knees beside the stump, clutching the locket to her chest as her shoulders began to shake. Elias had seen enough grief in his time to recognize it when it struck. Whatever that locket meant to her, its loss had carved a deep wound. Its return had torn that wound open again. He waited, patient as winter, while she wept silently in the darkness. When she finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears that caught the lamplight like scattered stars. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" The mountain woman's question hung in the thin air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Elias could see her more clearly now in the spill of lamplight from her cabin. Not the wild-haired creature of local legend, but a woman perhaps in her early 40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her clothes were simple but well-mended, a brown wool dress, sturdy boots, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the mountain chill. "I don't know how," Elias said gently. "I only know I found it where I said I did." She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, still cradling the locket with the other. "This was buried with her. I put it in the coffin myself 23 years ago." "Her?" "My daughter." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Mary Catherine. She was 6 years old." Understanding struck Elias like a physical blow. The little girl in the daguerreotype, solemn and sweet. Gone for over 2 decades, yet here was her locket, somehow returned from the grave. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it. He'd delivered news of death to countless families over the years, had watched parents crumble under the weight of such grief. But he'd never seen anything quite like this, the impossible return of something that should have stayed buried. The woman, he still didn't know her name, struggled to her feet. The rifle lay forgotten beside the stump. "You said you found it in town?" "Behind Jensen's livery stable, half covered by snow from last week's storm." She stared at him with eyes that seemed to hold 20 years of accumulated sorrow. "That's not possible." I watched them lower her coffin into the ground. I watched them shovel dirt over it. "This locket was around her neck. Ma'am, I know how it sounds. Do you?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you know what it's like to bury your only child and then have some stranger show up claiming her jewelry fell from heaven?" Elias raised his hands, palms out. "I'm not claiming anything except what happened. I saw something glinting in the snow and I picked it up. When I opened it and saw that little girl's picture, I thought someone in town might be missing it. The innkeeper told me about you, and I figured the innkeeper told you I was a murderer. It wasn't a question." Elias could see in her face that she knew exactly what stories the townspeople told about her. "He told me what he believed. Doesn't mean I have to believe it too." She studied him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, his graying hair, the way he held himself with the careful balance of a man accustomed to danger. "You're not from around here?" "No, ma'am. Just passing through. Thought I might stay the winter, but I haven't decided yet." "What's your trade?" "Was a lawman. 37 years wearing a badge. Retired last month." Something shifted in her expression, not fear exactly, but a new wariness. "A lawman. Come all the way up here to arrest the crazy mountain woman." "If I'd come to arrest you, I'd have brought a warrant and a posse. I came to return something that looked important to someone." She walked slowly back toward her cabin, the locket still clutched in her fist. At the door, she turned back to him. "My name is Sarah Whitmore." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "You can water your horse at the creek if he's thirsty. There's a place to tie him by that big pine." It wasn't quite an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. Elias led Judge to the creek, a small stream that bubbled down from higher elevations, running clear and cold even this late in the season. While the horse drank, Elias studied Sarah's homestead. Everything spoke of careful preparation and self-sufficiency. The cabin was small but solid, built to withstand mountain winters. The garden had been laid out with an understanding of drainage and sun exposure. Tools hung neatly under the overhang, sharp and well-maintained. This was the work of someone who knew how to survive alone, but also someone who took pride in doing things properly. When he looked up, Sarah was standing in her doorway again, no longer holding the rifle. "How did she die?" he asked softly. "Fever. Started as a cold, but it settled in her chest and wouldn't leave. I tried everything, willow bark tea, steam treatments, poultices. Nothing worked." Her voice was steady now, as if telling the story had worn smooth the sharp edges of grief. By the end, she was burning up, talking to people who weren't there. She kept asking for her papa. Where was her father? Dead 2 years by then. Kicked by a horse while he was shoeing it. Mary Catherine was all I had left. Sarah touched the locket to her lips. "I put this around her neck before they closed the coffin. It was her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations. I wanted her to have something beautiful with her." Elias found himself thinking of his own losses. Martha, who'd chosen safety over love. His partner, Jake, shot down by rustlers outside Tucson. His mother, who'd died alone while he was chasing outlaws through the Colorado Territory. Different griefs, but grief all the same. "I can see why you'd want to get away from people after something like that," he said. It wasn't just the grief. Sarah stepped fully outside now, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "People in town, they blamed me, said if I'd been a proper Christian woman, God wouldn't have taken my child. Said I must have done something terrible to deserve such punishment. That's foolish talk, is it? Sometimes I wondered myself. I was never good at following rules, never good at keeping my mouth shut when I saw something wrong. Maybe God was punishing me for my pride." From inside the cabin came a soft thudding sound, like something falling. Sarah tensed immediately, her head turning toward the noise. What was that? Nothing. Just the wind, but there was no wind. The night air was perfectly still. Elias took a step toward the cabin, and Sarah moved quickly to block his path. "You need to go now." "Sarah, please." I'm grateful you returned the locket, but you need to leave. Now, there it was again, a soft scraping sound from inside the cabin, like boot heels across wooden planks. Someone was in there. Someone Sarah didn't want him to see. You're not alone up here. I said leave, but Elias had spent too many years reading people to miss the signs. The way her eyes darted toward the cabin and back, the tension in her shoulders, the protective stance she'd taken between him and her door. Sarah, if someone's threatening you, no one's threatening me. A new sound came from the cabin then, a man's voice, low and urgent. Sarah, what's happening out there? She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Elias saw resignation there. Tommy, she called back. It's all right. The door opened wider and a man stepped out beside her. He was tall and lean, with shaggy brown hair and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when he looked at Elias, there was no madness there. Only fear. Tommy Barkley? Elias asked, though he already knew the answer. The man nodded slowly. Been a long time since anyone called me by that name. Elias felt the pieces clicking together in his mind, like tumblers in a lock. The boy who'd supposedly been murdered by the mountain woman. Very much alive and hiding in her cabin. Folks in town think you're dead. Better that way. Tommy moved to stand beside Sarah, not touching her but close enough to offer protection if needed. Safer for everyone. Safer from what? Sarah and Tommy exchanged a look loaded with meaning. Whatever secret they were keeping, it was big enough to fake a death and live as hermits for over 20 years. From the truth, Sarah said finally. Some truths are too dangerous to tell. She reached into a pocket of her dress and withdrew something small, a wooden cross, no bigger than her palm, carved with intricate designs and worn smooth by handling. You want to know what really happened to Tommy Barkley? You want to know why I've been living up here alone all these years? She held up the cross. It started with this, and it ends with more blood than this town has ever seen. The cross caught the lamplight, and Elias could see symbols carved into its surface. Not the simple Christian imagery he'd expected, but something older, more complex. What is it? Proof, Tommy said grimly. Proof of what they did to her family, what they tried to do to her, what they'll do to anyone who gets too close to the truth. Sarah looked at the locket in her other hand, then at the cross. Two artifacts from her past, both carrying weight far beyond their size. You want to understand, Mr. Cross? Then you'd better come inside. But I warn you, once you know what we know, there's no going back to your peaceful retirement. She turned toward the cabin, and after a moment's hesitation, Elias followed. Whatever truth waited inside was going to change everything. The inside of Sarah's cabin was nothing like Elias had expected. Where the townspeople's stories had led him to imagine a witch's hovel filled with strange potions and occult symbols, he found instead a space that spoke of intelligence, dignity, and carefully maintained order. Books lined shelves built into the log walls, not just almanacs and practical manuals, but volumes of poetry, history, and philosophy. A writing desk sat near the single window, equipped with good paper, ink, and several pens in various stages of use. The furniture was simple but well-crafted, and everything had been arranged with an eye toward both function and beauty. Sit, Sarah said, gesturing toward a chair near the fireplace. Tommy, put the kettle on. The younger man moved with practiced efficiency around the small kitchen area, clearly at home in the space. As he worked, Elias studied him more carefully. Tommy Barkley had to be in his 30s now, but there was something about his movements that still carried echoes of the curious boy he'd once been. Quick, alert, always seeming to listen for sounds beyond the walls. You've been living here all this time? Elias asked. Not here in the cabin, Tommy replied, measuring tea leaves into a pot. I have my own place, about a mile higher up the mountain, but I come down most evenings. Sarah and we look out for each other. Sarah had taken the chair across from Elias, the locket, and the wooden cross resting on a small table between them. In the firelight, she looked younger somehow, as if the act of no longer hiding had lifted years from her shoulders. Tell me about the cross, Elias said. Sarah picked it up, turning it over in her hands. This belonged to my mother. And her mother before that. It's been in our family for 3 generations. It doesn't look like any Christian cross I've seen. Because it's not. Not entirely. She traced one of the carved symbols with her fingertip. My grandmother came from the old country, Poland, and she brought certain traditions with her. Ways of honoring the dead, protecting the living, understanding the connections between past and present. Tommy set 3 cups on the table and poured the tea. The liquid steamed in the cool cabin air, filling the space with the scent of chamomile and mint. The townspeople would call it witchcraft, Sarah continued, but it was just knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. Healing herbs, yes, ways to read the weather and the seasons, but mostly just the understanding that some things in this world run deeper than what we can see on the surface. Schlier sipped his tea, thinking, and someone objected to this knowledge? Someone objected to what the knowledge revealed. Sarah set down the cross and reached for something else, a small wooden box that had been sitting on the mantelpiece. She opened it carefully, revealing what looked like dried flowers and folded papers. 2 weeks after I buried Mary Catherine, I was cleaning out her things, going through her clothes, her toys, trying to decide what to keep and what to... Her voice caught slightly. What to give away. You don't have to... Yes, I do. You need to understand. She lifted out one of the folded papers. I found this tucked inside her favorite doll. A note written in a child's hand. She unfolded the paper and handed it to Elias. The writing was shaky but readable. Mama, the man in the black coat came again. He said not to tell you, but I am scared. He smells like the medicine that made Papa sick. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. What medicine? The tonic Dr. Brennan gave my husband for his headaches. Marcus started having terrible pains in his head about 6 months before the horse kicked him. Dr. Brennan said it was the altitude. Prescribed a special tonic made with ingredients from back east. Tommy leaned forward. Show him the rest. Sarah reached into the box again, this time pulling out a small glass vial, empty now, but still carrying traces of a dark residue around the bottom. I kept one bottle. Something about it bothered me. The smell, the way it made Marcus sleepy and confused. After Mary Catherine died, after I found her note, I took this to a druggist in Denver. Had him test what was left. What did he find? Arsenic. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to cause headaches, confusion, weakness. Enough to make a man careless around horses. The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. Someone was poisoning your husband. Slowly, carefully, making it look like accidents and natural causes. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she folded the note. And then they came after Mary Catherine. The man in the black coat, Dr. Brennan. He wore a long black coat when he made house calls. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. That sweet child tried to protect me even as she was dying. Never said a word about his visits. Just left me that note where she knew I'd find it. Eventually, Tommy reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with his own, a gesture of comfort. Between old friends who'd shared too much pain, I was collecting kindling that morning, Tommy said quietly. The morning everyone thinks I died. I saw Dr. Brennan's buggy heading up toward Sarah's place, but I knew Marcus was already dead, and Mary Catherine was buried. I got curious. You followed him, hid in the trees outside the cabin, heard him talking to Sarah about settling her affairs, selling the land, moving back to town where people could take proper care of her. But Sarah wasn't having any of it. She was asking questions about the tonic, about why he'd been visiting Mary Catherine. Elias could see where this was heading. He realized she was getting suspicious. More than that. Sarah told him about the note Mary Catherine had left. Told him she was planning to take the medicine bottle to Denver for testing. Tommy's jaw tightened. That's when he pulled out his medical bag. Sarah stood abruptly, walking to a trunk in the corner of the cabin. She opened it and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. A wedding dress, yellowed with age but still beautiful, with delicate lace and tiny pearl buttons. This was my mother's wedding dress. I wore it when I married Marcus. I was saving it for Mary Catherine, for when she grew up and found someone to love. She held the dress against her chest, and Elias could see tears streaming down her face. Dr. Brennan told me I wouldn't need to worry about such things anymore. Said he had something that would help me join my family peacefully. He was going to kill you, make it look like grief had driven me to take my own life. The grieving mother, unable to live without her child. Very romantic, very believable. Sarah's voice turned bitter. Except Tommy was watching from the trees. I threw a rock through the window, Tommy said. Biggest rock I could find. Created enough of a distraction for Sarah to get away from him, but not enough to get away clean. Sarah sat back down, still holding the wedding dress. He chased me into the woods. I had the cross with me. I always carried it for protection, and I hit him with it as hard as I could. Caught him right across the temple. He went down like a felled tree, dead. No, but unconscious and bleeding. Tommy and we dragged him back to his buggy, made it look like his horse had spooked and thrown him against a tree branch. Tommy smiled grimly. When he woke up, he'd have a hell of a headache and no clear memory of what happened. But he'd still know you were suspicious. Which is why Sarah had to disappear, Tommy said. And why I had to die. We tore up my shirt, smeared it with Dr. Brennan's blood, and left it near Widow's Creek. Then Sarah came up here to this old hunting cabin, and I went even higher up the mountain. Elias set down his teacup, his mind working through the implications. So Dr. Brennan got away with murder. Murders, Sarah corrected. I spent the first winter up here, thinking it through, and I realized Marcus wasn't the first. Dr. Brennan had been the physician for every suspicious death in Millhaven for the past 10 years. The widow Henderson, whose heart gave out right after she'd changed her will. The prospector who fell into that mine shaft just after he'd filed a big claim. The banker's wife who died of pneumonia right after she'd discovered her husband was embezzling. Why didn't you go to the law? Who would believe the word of a grieving woman against the town doctor? Especially when that woman had already been labeled as strange, foreign, practicing unnatural arts. Sarah laughed bitterly. Besides, Dr. Brennan wasn't working alone. Too many people benefited from those convenient deaths. The sheriff got his cut, the judge got his, the mayor got his. The fire popped in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the dark forest, its voice lonely and wild. So you've been hiding up here for 20 years, knowing the truth but unable to prove it. Until now, Tommy said quietly. Until someone threw your wife's locket into that snow where a retired lawman would find it. Sarah's eyes met Elias's across the table. That locket was buried 6 feet underground in a sealed coffin. There's no earthly way it should have turned up behind a livery stable. Unless someone dug it up. Unless someone wanted it found, Sarah said. Someone who knows the truth and wants justice. Someone who's been watching and waiting for the right person to come along. She stood and walked to the window, pulling back the simple curtain to look out into the darkness. The question is, Mr. Cross, are you the right person? Elias stared at the wedding dress Sarah still held, its ivory silk catching the firelight like captured moonbeams. The weight of what she'd told him settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. 20 years of injustice, 20 years of hiding, 20 years of a truth that could destroy half the town if it ever saw daylight. Show me, he said quietly. Show you what? The family Bible. Every family like yours would have had one, with births and deaths recorded, marriage certificates, family history. If what you're telling me is true, there should be documentation. Sarah and Tommy exchanged another of those loaded glances. Then Sarah nodded and walked to a different trunk, this one smaller and bound with iron straps. She lifted the lid carefully, as if opening a coffin, and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. The Bible was massive, bound in leather that had once been deep brown, but was now faded to the color of old earth. But as Sarah unwrapped it, Elias could see that portions of the cover were blackened and scorched, as if it had been rescued from a fire. They tried to burn everything, she said, setting the Bible on the table with reverent care. The night after Dr. Brennan's accident, someone broke into my cabin while I was up here hiding, scattered kerosene around and set it ablaze. Tommy saved what he could. She opened the Bible to the family record section, and Elias could see why someone had wanted it destroyed. The pages were singed around the edges, but still readable, and they told a story very different from what the town believed. Sarah Elizabeth Kowalski, he read aloud from the marriage record. Married to Marcus James Whitmore, October 15th, 1851. My maiden name, Sarah said softly. Before I became a Whitmore, Elias turned the page, finding the birth records. Mary Catherine Whitmore, born March 3rd, 1858. Parents, Marcus James and Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. His finger moved down to the death records. Marcus James Whitmore died June 10th, 1862. Cause of death. He paused, squinting at the faded ink. Natural causes, following prolonged illness. I wrote that before I knew better, Sarah said bitterly. Before I understood what prolonged illness really meant. The next entry made Elias's chest tighten. Mary Catherine Whitmore died September 22nd, 1864. Aged 6 years, 5 months, 19 days. Cause of death, fever following respiratory ailment. Below that, in different ink, someone had added, buried with grandmother's silver locket, her family tradition. You wrote that too, the night before the funeral. I wanted there to be a record that the locket went with her. Sarah touched the Bible's scorched pages. I never imagined I'd see it again. Tommy leaned forward, pointing to another section of the Bible. Show him the land records. Sarah turned several pages until she found a section filled with legal documents, deeds, surveys, mineral rights. The papers were brown with age but still legible. The Whitmore homestead, she said. 160 acres, including mineral rights. Purchased from the territorial government in 1850. Paid in full. Marcus inherited it from his father, and when he died, it passed to me. When I died, or was supposed to die, it would have passed to Mary Catherine. But Mary Catherine died first, which meant the property should have passed to Marcus's next of kin. Sarah's finger traced down a family tree, drawn in careful script, his brother Daniel living in California. But somehow, the land ended up being sold for back taxes just 2 weeks after I disappeared up this mountain. Elias studied the documents. Who bought it? A consortium of local businessmen. The sheriff, the judge, the mayor, the banker, all represented by Dr. Brennan, who claimed power of attorney over my affairs due to my mental incapacity following tragic loss. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture of corruption that reached into every corner of Millhaven's power structure. They killed your husband and daughter for the land, for what's under the land, Tommy corrected. Show him the survey map. Sarah unfolded a large piece of paper covered with carefully drawn lines and measurements. Marcus had this done just before he started getting the headaches. He'd found traces of silver in the creek that runs through our property. Not a lot, but enough to make it worth investigating. The men who bought your land, they knew about the silver? Dr. Brennan knew. Marcus consulted him about some stomach pains he'd been having after working near the creek, probably from handling the silver ore with his bare hands. Dr. Brennan examined the samples Marcus brought in. Told him it was probably just pyrite. Fool's gold. But it wasn't. It wasn't. Sarah refolded the map with practiced care. Within 6 months of buying the property, they'd established a small mining operation. Nothing too obvious, nothing that would attract attention from outside investors. Just enough to make them all very wealthy over the years. Elias sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. And you've known all this for 20 years. Knowing and proving are two different things, Tommy said. Sarah had the family records, but that just proved she owned the land. It didn't prove murder. What about the arsenic in the medicine bottle? Gone. After the fire, I went back to check the hiding place where I'd kept it. Someone had been there first. Sarah's voice carried 20 years of frustration. Without the bottle, without witnesses, without bodies to examine, all we had was speculation. You could have tried anyway. Gone to the territorial authorities, the federal marshals. With what? The word of a woman everyone believed was dead, backed up by a boy everyone knew was dead. Sarah shook her head. They'd have locked me up in an asylum and Tommy in prison for fraud. The fire had burned low while they talked, and Tommy got up to add another log. As the flames caught, new light danced across the cabin walls, illuminating the books, the careful furniture, the evidence of 2 decades spent in hiding. "So what changed?" Elias asked. "Why is that locket surfacing now?" "Because people are starting to ask questions," Tommy said. "Different questions than they used to ask." "What kind of questions?" Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 months ago, a stranger came to town. A young man from Denver, said he was a journalist writing about mining operations in the territory. Started asking about the Silver Creek mine. That's what they call the operation, on my old land now. What did he want to know? Who owned it? How long it had been operating? Whether there'd ever been any disputes over the mineral rights. Normal questions, but they made certain people very nervous. Nervous enough to do something about it. The journalist left town 2 days after he arrived, supposedly called away on urgent business back in Denver. Tommy's expression was grim, but Henrik found his horse wandering loose near Devil's Canyon, still saddled, saddlebags intact, and no sign of the rider. None. Of course, the sheriff organized a search party, but they didn't find anything. Another tragic accident in dangerous country. Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The sensation he'd always gotten when a case was about to break wide open. "You think they killed him? I think they've been killing people for 20 years, and they're not about to stop now." Sarah stood and walked to the window again, peering out into the darkness. "Which is why you need to leave, Mr. Cross. Go back to town, collect your things, and ride out of here. Find yourself a nice, quiet place to retire, somewhere far away from Millhaven and its secrets." "Is that what you want me to do?" She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What I want is my daughter back. What I want is my husband alive and healthy and working his land. What I want is to wear that wedding dress to my daughter's ceremony someday, the way my mother wore it to mine." She turned from the window, and Elias could see tears streaming down her face. "But I can't have any of those things. The best I can hope for is that no one else dies because of their greed. Sarah, 20 years. Mr. Cross, 20 years I've been living like a ghost, like something that should have died but didn't have the grace to lay down and quit breathing. 20 years of watching that mine pull silver out of my family's land while my husband and daughter rot in unmarked graves." She picked up the locket from the table, holding it up so the firelight struck it. This locket appearing now, just when someone new is asking questions, that's not a coincidence. That's a message. Someone knows the truth, someone with access to my daughter's grave, someone who wants justice as much as I do. Then we find out who. "No," her voice was firm. "You ride out of here tomorrow morning and you don't look back. Tommy and we've survived this long by staying hidden. We can survive a little longer." But Elias was already shaking his head. "I spent 37 years wearing a badge, ma'am. 37 years, hunting down men who thought they could get away with murder just because they were smart or rich or connected. I'm not about to stop now just because I retired." He stood, his joints protesting after the long evening of sitting. "Besides, I've got nowhere else to be. And it seems to me that whoever left that locket where I'd find it chose me for this job." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "You're a stubborn man, Elias Cross." "Yes, ma'am. I've been told that before." "Good," Tommy said from his place by the fire. "Because stubborn is exactly what we're going to need." The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp mountain clarity that made every pine needle and rock outcropping stand out in sharp relief. Elias had slept poorly in the small cot Tommy had set up for him near the fireplace, his mind churning through everything he'd learned. But as he stepped outside Sarah's cabin into the thin air and golden sunrise, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. Sarah was already up, tending to a small fire outside where she was preparing breakfast. She looked up as he approached, and he could see that she'd slept poorly too, if at all. "Coffee," she offered, gesturing to a pot balanced on a flat stone near the flames. "Much obliged," he accepted the tin cup she poured, savoring the strong, bitter brew. "Where's Tommy?" "Gone up to his place to collect some things." If we're really going to do this, if we're really going to try to prove what happened, we're going to need everything he's gathered over the years. What kind of things? Sarah stirred something in an iron pan, eggs and what looked like wild mushrooms. Tommy never stopped investigating. Even after we decided it was too dangerous to pursue, he kept watching, kept listening, kept collecting evidence. He has a good memory and better instincts than most lawmen I've known. Elias sipped his coffee, thinking about that. How old was he when this all started? 12. Just a curious boy who liked to explore. But what he saw that day, what they tried to do to me, it changed him. Made him grow up fast. She divided the eggs onto 2 plates. Eat. You'll need your strength. The food was simple but well prepared, seasoned with herbs that Sarah had clearly gathered and dried herself. As they ate, she began to talk about the years since her exile, painting a picture of survival that was both admirable and heartbreaking. The first winter was the hardest, she said. I knew nothing about living alone in the mountains. Tommy helped when he could, but he was just a boy, and he had to be careful not to be seen. I nearly died of cold that December, would have if not for an old Indian woman who found me half frozen and taught me how to properly bank a fire, how to preserve food, how to read the weather signs. There are Indians up here. Were. A small band of Ute who used this area as a hunting ground. Most moved on years ago, but a few stayed. They understood about being hunted, about needing to stay hidden. Sarah's expression grew soft with memory. They never asked questions about why a white woman was living alone in the mountains. They just helped. What happened to them? Same thing that happens to most folks who get in the way of progress. The mining operation expanded, claimed more land, hired men with guns to keep trespassers away. The Ute weren't considered human enough to have property rights. Elias set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. How many people have died because of this conspiracy? I stopped counting after the first dozen. Sarah's voice was flat. Some were accidents. Men who got too curious about the mine, travelers who saw too much, claim jumpers who didn't understand that the game was rigged. Others were more deliberate. Anyone who posed a real threat to the operation. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Tommy was riding down the trail on a sturdy mountain pony, saddlebags bulging with whatever evidence he'd collected over the years. "Morning," he called as he dismounted. "Beautiful day for bringing down a conspiracy." Despite everything, Sarah smiled. "You're in a good mood." First time in 20 years I've felt hopeful. Tommy began unloading his saddlebags. First time I believed we might actually get justice for what they did. He carried his burden into the cabin, and Sarah and Elias followed. On the rough wooden table, Tommy began laying out documents, photographs, maps, and what looked like personal items. "I've been busy," he said simply. The collection was impressive and disturbing. There were photographs of the mine operation taken from various hiding places in the surrounding hills. Maps showing the expansion of the Silver Creek mine over the years, with dates and property acquisitions noted in Tommy's careful handwriting. Copies of legal documents, some clearly obtained through less than official channels. But what caught Elias's attention was a yellowed letter, folded and refolded until the creases were nearly worn through. "What's this?" "The smoking gun," Tommy said grimly. "Found it in Dr. Brennan's medical bag after he died 5 years ago. Brennan's dead. Heart attack, supposedly. Though given what we know about his methods, I've always wondered if someone decided he knew too much." Sarah picked up the letter, handling it like a venomous snake. "This is a letter from a pharmaceutical company in St. Louis, acknowledging his regular orders of arsenic trioxide for experimental treatments." Elias took the letter, reading the formal business language that disguised something monstrous. The company thanked Dr. Brennan for his continued patronage and confirmed that his monthly shipments would continue as long as he needed them for his research into gradual neurological treatments. "Monthly shipments," Elias said. "For how long?" "The letter is dated 1859, 3 years before Marcus died. But Tommy found similar correspondence going back to 1856, 8 years of regular arsenic orders, at least. And that's just from one supplier." Tommy pulled out another document, what looked like a shipping manifest. I managed to get a look at this when the supply wagon was making deliveries to town. Dr. Brennan was also receiving regular shipments of laudanum, mercury compounds, and something called Fowler's solution. What's Fowler's solution? Arsenic in liquid form, marketed as a tonic for various ailments, but lethal in the right doses. Sarah sat down heavily in her chair. A man could take it for months, slowly getting sicker. Before anyone realized what was happening, Elias spread the documents out on the table, his lawman's mind automatically organizing the evidence into categories. This is good. This is very good, but it's still mostly circumstantial. We can prove Brennan had access to poisons, but we can't prove he used them to murder specific people. Actually, we can. Tommy reached into his bag again and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. Dr. Brennan kept detailed records of his treatments, very detailed. He opened the journal to a page marked with a piece of string. Listen to this. Patient MW continues to respond well to graduated dosage increases. Headaches and confusion increasing as expected. Recommend continuing current protocol until desired outcome achieved. Patient's wife shows signs of suspicion. May need to adjust treatment plan accordingly. MW, Marcus Whitmore. There are dozens of entries like this. Patients identified by initials, but with enough detail to figure out who they were. The widow Henderson, HH, the banker's wife, EF, the prospector, JM. Tommy flipped through the pages. He documented every murder like he was conducting scientific research. Sarah stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains that had been her prison for 20 years. How did you get this? Patience, planning, and a little bit of luck. Tommy's voice carried a hint of pride. After Brennan died, his house was supposed to be cleaned out by his nephew from Denver. But the nephew never showed up, probably another convenient accident. The house sat empty for months before anyone thought to check on it. I may have visited a few times during that period. You broke into a dead man's house. I recovered evidence of multiple murders. I'd call that justice, not burglary. Elias was still reading the journal, his anger growing with each page. The clinical detachment with which Brennan had documented his crimes was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated, methodical killings carried out over years. There's something else, Tommy said quietly. Something I found just last week. He pulled out a final document, this one newer than the rest. A letter written on official territorial government letterhead. What is it? A land survey report commissioned by the Territorial Mining Authority. Seems there's been some interest from outside investors in the Silver Creek mine. Big Eastern syndicate looking to buy out the local operation. Elias read the letter quickly. They're planning to sell. They're planning to run. The survey estimates the remaining silver reserves at maybe 2 more years of profitable extraction. After that, the mine will be played out. Sarah had turned from the window, her face pale. They're going to take their profits and disappear, leaving behind 20 years of corpses and a hole in the ground. Not if we stop them first, Elias said. He stood, gathering the documents into neat piles. For the first time since retiring, he felt like a lawman again, focused, determined, ready to see justice done. We need to get this evidence to the territorial authorities. The federal marshal's office in Denver, maybe the territorial governor himself. That's a 2-day ride to Denver, Tommy pointed out. And we'd be traveling with enough evidence to hang half the town leadership. You think they're going to just let us ride away? Sarah moved to another trunk, this one smaller than the others. She opened it and withdrew something wrapped in dark cloth. They're not going to let us do anything, she said, unwrapping what turned out to be a well-maintained rifle. We've been hiding for 20 years, letting them think they won. But now they know someone's asking questions. Now they know their secret isn't safe anymore. She checked the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. The time for hiding is over. One way or another, this ends now. The afternoon sun was slanting through the pine trees when they saw the first signs of trouble. Tommy had been keeping watch from a high outcropping above the cabin when he came sliding down the rocky slope, his face grim with urgency. "Riders coming up the trail," he announced breathlessly. 5 of them, maybe 6, armed and moving slow, like they're being careful. Sarah immediately began gathering the evidence they'd spread across the table, stuffing documents back into Tommy's saddlebags with quick, practiced movements. "How much time do we have?" 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they stop to scout the approaches. Elias checked his pistol, muscle memory from decades of law enforcement taking over. "Any other way off this mountain?" "Game trails, but nothing a horse could navigate. And they'd have us trapped up there with no supplies." Tommy shouldered his own rifle. "Our best bet is to make a stand here and hope we can convince them we're not worth the trouble. Or convince them we're too dangerous to take lightly," Sarah said, working the lever action on her rifle to chamber a round. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd planned for this moment, even if they'd hoped it would never come. Sarah and Tommy took positions at the cabin's 2 windows, while Elias positioned himself near the door, where he could cover the main approach. "Who do you think they are?" Elias asked. "Could be anyone," Tommy replied. "Sheriff's deputies, mine security hired guns from Denver. After 20 years of keeping this secret, they've got plenty of resources to draw on." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, echoing off the rocky walls of the narrow canyon that led to Sarah's homestead. Through the window, Elias could see movement in the trees, dark shapes that resolved into mounted men as they drew nearer. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing to a gap in the pine branches. "I count 6. All carrying rifles." The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard, but far enough away to avoid immediate gunfire. One of them, a man with a deputy's badge glinting on his vest, cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Sarah Whitmore, we know you're in there. Come out peaceable and nobody has to get hurt." Sarah and Tommy exchanged glances. After 20 years of being presumed dead, hearing her name shouted by a lawman carried a surreal quality. "What do you want?" she called back. "Just to talk. We're investigating some missing property, and we think you might be able to help us." "What kind of property?" There was a pause, and Elias could see the men conferring among themselves. When the deputy spoke again, his tone had changed. Less friendly, more businesslike. "A journal that was stolen from Dr. Brennan's residence, along with some other documents that don't belong to you." Tommy smiled grimly. "Guess we know what this is about." "I don't know anything about any journal," Sarah shouted back. "Ma'am, we have witnesses who saw someone breaking into the deceased doctor's house. We know the stolen property is up there with you." Elias moved closer to the window, studying the positioning of the riders. They'd spread out in a rough semicircle, covering all the obvious escape routes. These weren't amateur gunmen. They knew their business. "Sarah Whitmore." The deputy tried again. "You've got 1 minute to come out with your hands up and the stolen property in view. If you don't, we're authorized to use whatever force is necessary." "Authorized by who?" Elias called out, his voice carrying the authority of 37 years behind a badge. Another pause. "Who's asking?" "Elias Cross, retired sheriff of Tucson County." This time the pause was longer. Elias could see animated discussion among the riders, and he got the sense that his presence was complicating their plans. "Sheriff Cross, this is Deputy Marshal Williams out of Denver. We're conducting official territorial business here. Stand aside and let us do our job." Elias had never heard of a Deputy Marshal Williams, and something about the man's tone suggested he was lying. Real federal marshals didn't conduct raids based on reports of burglary. They had bigger concerns to worry about. "Let me see some identification." Elias shouted back, "You'll see all the identification you need." "Last chance, Whitmore. Come out now, or we're coming in." Sarah looked at Elias, her eyes reflecting 20 years of accumulated fear and anger. "They're not here to arrest me. They're here to make sure I never tell anyone what I know." "How can you be sure?" "Because if they really believed I was just a thief, they'd wait me out. Set up a siege, starve me down the mountain. They're in a hurry because they know time is running out." Tommy had moved to the back window, keeping watch on their rear approaches. Movement in the trees behind us. "Looks like they're trying to surround the cabin." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. 6 armed men, possibly more with high ground and superior numbers. The cabin offered some protection, but it was also a trap if they allowed themselves to be surrounded. "Time's up," Deputy Williams shouted. "You made your choice." The first shot shattered Sarah's front window, sending glass cascading across the cabin floor. It was followed immediately by a volley from multiple rifles, the bullets splintering wood and punching holes through the cabin's log walls. Sarah and Elias returned fire, aiming for the muzzle flashes visible in the tree line. The sharp crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls, creating a thunderous cacophony that sent birds exploding from the pine branches. "They're moving up on the left," Tommy called out, firing through the back window at shapes moving through the underbrush. Elias tried to count shots to get a sense of how much ammunition their attackers had. But the firing was too rapid, too chaotic. These men had come prepared for a siege. A bullet punched through the wall near Elias's head, showering him with wood splinters. He ducked low and moved to a different position, trying to get a clear shot at the deputy who seemed to be directing the attack. "Sarah," he called over the gunfire. "Is there any other way out of here?" "Root cellar," she replied, ejecting spent shells from her rifle. "Trapdoor near the fireplace. It leads to a tunnel that comes out near the creek." "How long is the tunnel?" "Maybe 30 yards, but it's barely wide enough for one person." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin. One of the attackers had worked his way around to the side and was firing through what had once been the kitchen window. Glass and crockery exploded across the floor. "We can't stay here," Tommy shouted. "They're going to burn us out." As if summoned by his words, the smell of smoke began to drift through the shattered windows. Someone had set fire to the woodpile under the lean-to, and the flames were already licking at the cabin's outer walls. "The tunnel!" Sarah ordered. "Now, while the smoke gives us cover." She led them to the fireplace, where she pulled away a rag rug to reveal a wooden trapdoor set into the floor. The opening below was black as a grave, but Elias could feel cool air flowing up from its depths. "Tommy first," Sarah said. "Then you, Elias. I'll cover the rear." "Like hell," Elias replied. "You go first. I'll hold them off. This is my home, my fight, and I'm still a lawman even without the badge." He shoved fresh cartridges into his pistol. "Go! That's an order!" Sarah stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Don't get yourself killed, Elias Cross. I've got plans for you." She dropped through the trapdoor like a stone, disappearing into the darkness below. Tommy followed, leaving Elias alone in the smoke-filled cabin, with bullets whistling through the air around him. He fired 3 quick shots toward the front window, then dropped through the trapdoor just as the roof beam above his head exploded in a shower of sparks and burning wood. The tunnel was everything Sarah had warned him about. Narrow, low-ceilinged, carved out of rocky soil that scraped against his shoulders as he crawled forward. Behind him, he could hear the crackling of flames as the cabin began to burn in earnest. Ahead, he could see a circle of daylight growing larger as he approached the tunnel's exit. Sarah and Tommy were already there, crouched behind a fallen log near the creek bank. "They'll figure out where we went soon enough," Sarah said as he emerged, blinking in the afternoon sunlight. "We need to move fast." "Where?" Tommy pointed up the mountainside toward a series of rocky ledges and hidden canyons that looked like a maze of stone and shadow. "Higher ground, better cover, and something else they're going to wish they'd never seen." "What?" 20 years' worth of evidence," Sarah said grimly. "Hidden where they'll never find it, even if they kill all 3 of us." Behind them, Sarah's cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, sending a pillar of black smoke high into the clear mountain air. The attackers would be regrouping soon, realizing their prey had escaped through the underground passage. "Lead the way," Elias said, checking his remaining ammunition. "Time to see what 20 years of preparation looks like." The hidden canyon Tommy led them to was a natural fortress, carved into the mountainside by centuries of wind and water. Towering walls of red stone rose on 3 sides, with only one narrow entrance that could be easily defended. But what caught Elias's attention wasn't the tactical advantages of their position. It was the cave. The opening was concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Tommy pushed the vegetation aside and gestured for them to follow him into the darkness. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the depths of the cave. Moments later, the space filled with the warm glow of lamplight. What Elias saw inside took his breath away. The cave was larger than Sarah's cabin had been, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the reach of the lamplight. But it wasn't the size that stunned him. It was what Tommy had built inside. Tables lined the walls, covered with maps, photographs, documents, and artifacts. Shelves carved into the rock held books, journals, and carefully labeled containers. In one corner, a desk was set up with writing materials and what looked like a printing press. In another, supplies were stacked floor to ceiling. Food, ammunition, tools, everything needed to survive a long siege. "My God," Elias breathed. "How long have you been preparing this?" 20 years, Tommy replied, lighting additional lamps around the space. "Ever since Sarah and I realized we were going to be in this fight for the long haul." Sarah moved to one of the tables, her hands trailing over familiar objects. "This is where we've been documenting everything. Every suspicious death, every land transfer, every shipment of poison that came to Dr. Brennan's office. You've been investigating all this time? What else were we going to do? Hide in the mountains until we died of old age?" Tommy walked to a large map mounted on the cave wall, a detailed survey of Millhaven and the surrounding territory. "We knew that someday someone would come along who could help us get justice. We wanted to be ready." The map was covered with pins, strings, and notations. Elias could see patterns emerging, connections between the various murders, land acquisitions, and mining operations that painted a picture of conspiracy far more extensive than he'd imagined. "There," Sarah said, pointing to a cluster of red pins near the center of town. "Every suspicious death in Millhaven over the past 20 years. Notice anything?" Elias studied the locations. "They're all near the main street. The business district. Property owners," Tommy explained. "People who owned land that was valuable, or buildings that someone else wanted, or businesses that were in the way of expansion. And here," Sarah moved to another section of the map, "are all the subsequent property transfers. Notice how quickly the dead people's assets ended up in the hands of the same small group of buyers. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. A systematic campaign of murder and theft that had been going on for 2 decades, enriching the same circle of conspirators while eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their operation. How many people are we talking about?" 43 confirmed deaths, Tommy said quietly. "Probably more that we haven't connected yet." Jesus. The Silver Creek mine was just the beginning. Once they saw how easy it was to kill someone and make it look natural, they branched out. Real estate speculation, business acquisitions, political manipulation. They've essentially turned Millhaven into their personal kingdom. Sarah moved to another table, this one covered with what looked like legal documents. Marriage certificates, wills, property deeds, all forged or altered to support their schemes. They even have a judge on the payroll who validates their fraudulent paperwork, Judge Morrison. Among others, the corruption goes all the way to the territorial capital. We have evidence of bribes paid to territorial legislators, mining inspectors, even federal officials. Elias felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd uncovered. This isn't just a local conspiracy. This is organized crime on a territorial scale, which is why we could never just walk into the sheriff's office and expect justice, Tommy said. Half the law enforcement in the territory is either bought, blackmailed, or too scared to act. But there's something else, Sarah said, her voice taking on a different quality. Something we discovered just recently that changes everything. She walked to a trunk in the far corner of the cave and withdrew something wrapped in oiled canvas. When she unwrapped it, Elias saw a leather-bound ledger, thick with entries written in multiple hands. What is it? The master record. Every payment, every bribe, every murder, documented in detail by the conspiracy's bookkeeper. Sarah opened the ledger to a random page. Listen to this. Payment to JM for elimination. Of Henderson widow, $500. Payment to territorial. Mining inspector for survey alterations, $1,000. Payment to federal marshal for delayed investigation, $2,000. They kept records of their crimes. They had to. An operation this big, with this many people involved, requires careful accounting. Everyone has to know who's been paid, who owes what, who can be trusted. Tommy moved closer, his expression serious. But here's the thing, Elias. We didn't steal this ledger from anyone's house. Then where did you get it? Someone gave it to us 3 days ago. Left it hidden near the entrance to this canyon, along with a note telling us where to find it. Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The note said, "The time has come for justice. Use this wisely." Who sent it? We don't know. But whoever it was had access to the conspiracy's most secret records, and they wanted us to have this information. Elias felt pieces of the puzzle shifting in his mind. The locket. Someone with access to your daughter's grave left that locket where I'd find it. Someone who knew a retired lawman would be curious enough to investigate, and now someone with access to the conspiracy's financial records has given us the evidence. We need to bring them all down. Sarah closed the ledger carefully. Someone on the inside wants this to end, but who? There's only one way to find out. Tommy walked to the printing press in the corner of the cave. We make enough copies of this evidence to ensure it can't all be destroyed. Then we force them into the open. How? Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Elias saw something dangerous in her expression. By giving them exactly what they're afraid of. Public exposure. She gestured toward the printing press. Tommy's been learning to use that. We're going to print up handbills with the most damning evidence, names, dates, amounts. Then we're going to distribute them all over Millhaven. That's suicide. The moment those handbills appear, every corrupt lawman in the territory will be hunting for us. Let them hunt. We're done hiding. Sarah picked up the silver locket from where she'd set it on one of the tables. My daughter has been waiting 23 years for justice. I'm not going to make her wait any longer. Besides, Tommy added, we have advantages they don't know about. This cave has multiple exits. We know these mountains better than anyone, and we're not the only ones who want to see this conspiracy destroyed. What do you mean? The families of the victims. The people who've lost property, lost loved ones, lost their livelihoods to these murderers. Most of them don't know the truth yet, but when they see the evidence, when they understand what's really been happening, they're going to want blood. Sarah nodded. The conspiracy's strength has always been secrecy. People couldn't fight back because they didn't know who their real enemies were. But once the truth comes out, half the town is going to want to string up the other half. Elias could see where this was heading. You're talking about starting a war. The war already started 23 years ago when they murdered my husband and daughter, Sarah said quietly. We're just finally going to start fighting back. She moved to another table and picked up a stack of photographs, images of the mine operation, the forged documents, the evidence of systematic murder and theft. Tommy, how long will it take to print enough handbills to distribute throughout the town? Working through the night. Maybe 100 copies by morning? Do it. Include the photographs, the financial records, everything that proves what they've been doing. Sarah turned to Elias. You still have your badge? It's not official anymore, but people will recognize it. People will listen to a lawman, even a retired one. Her eyes were bright with determination. Will you help us distribute these handbills? Will you stand with us when the shooting starts? Elias looked around the cave at 20 years of accumulated evidence, 20 years of patient preparation for this moment. Then he looked at Sarah, no longer the broken, grieving woman hiding in the mountains, but someone who'd found her strength and was ready to use it. Yes, he said simply, but we're going to do this right. No vigilante justice, no lynch mobs. We expose the truth and let the law, the real law, take its course. And if the real law won't act, then we make sure it has no choice. Dawn was still 2 hours away when Tommy finished printing the last of the handbills. The cave filled with the smell of ink and paper as he carefully stacked the completed sheets. each one containing enough evidence to destroy the conspiracy that had ruled Millhaven for 20 years. Elias picked up one of the handbills, studying it in the lamplight. Tommy had done excellent work. The layout was clean and readable, with the most damning evidence presented in a way that even the least educated citizen could understand. Photographs of forged documents, excerpts from Dr. Brennan's journal, and pages from the financial ledger were arranged under bold headlines that left no room for doubt. 20 years of murder and theft, read the main headline. Below that, in smaller but equally bold type, the truth about Millhaven's leading citizens. This is going to tear the town apart, Elias said. Good, Sarah replied. She was cleaning her rifle, preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous day of her life. It's time for people to choose sides. She'd changed out of her simple mountain dress into clothing more suited for what lay ahead: men's trousers, a heavy shirt, and sturdy boots. Around her waist, she wore a gun belt that had belonged to her late husband, the leather worn smooth from years of use. You sure about this? Elias asked, noting the way she handled the weapons with easy familiarity. Marcus taught me to shoot when we were first married. Said a woman living on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. Her smile was grim. He never imagined I'd be using his lessons to avenge his murder. Tommy had been quiet for most of the night, focused on his printing work. But now he looked up from the handbills with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. There's something I need to tell you both before we do this. What? The ledger. The one that mysteriously appeared 3 days ago. Tommy set down the stack of papers he'd been counting. I know who gave it to us. Sarah stopped cleaning her rifle. Who? Judge Morrison's clerk. A young man named David Chen, who came out from San Francisco 5 years ago to work in the territorial courts. Tommy's voice was steady, but Elias could hear the tension beneath it. He's been copying documents, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to act. How do you know this? Because he contacted me yesterday while you two were going through the evidence. Left a note at the old pine tree, where we sometimes leave messages for each other. Tommy pulled a folded paper from his pocket. He wants to meet with us. Says he has more evidence, enough to guarantee convictions in federal court. Sarah stood, her rifle cradled in her arms. It's a trap, maybe. Or maybe it's the break we've been waiting for. Tommy unfolded the note and read aloud. Mr. Barkley, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I have information that could end this conspiracy forever. The judge is planning to destroy all the court records tomorrow night and flee to Mexico with the other conspirators. If we're going to act, it has to be now. Meet me at the old church at midnight. Come alone, but bring the evidence you've gathered. Together we can ensure justice is finally done. Definitely a trap, Elias said. Not necessarily. Think about it. Someone had to be keeping the conspiracy's financial records. Someone with access to legal documents, court filings, and the trust of the major players. Tommy folded the note carefully. A judge's clerk would be perfect for that role. And if he's the one who's been keeping the books, he'd know exactly how much evidence we'd need to bring them all down, Sarah added thoughtfully. Or he'd know exactly how to lure us into an ambush. They stood in silence for a moment, weighing their options. Outside the cave, the first faint light of dawn was beginning to show above the eastern mountains. There's another possibility, Sarah said quietly. What if he's telling the truth about the records being destroyed? What if we're running out of time? Then we stick with the original plan. Distribute the handbills, force them into the open, and hope the territorial authorities respond quickly enough to prevent a bloodbath. Except the territorial authorities are part of the conspiracy, Tommy pointed out. At least some of them are. The ledger shows payments to federal marshals, mining inspectors, even judges in Denver. Elias picked up another handbill, thinking through their options. The evidence they had was damning, but would it be enough to guarantee convictions? Or would corrupt officials find ways to suppress it, discredit it, make it disappear, along with anyone who tried to present it? We need insurance, he said finally. What kind of insurance? The kind that ensures this evidence survives, even if we don't. Elias gestured toward the printing press. "How many copies can you make?" "As many as we have paper for. Maybe 300 if we work through the day. Then that's what we do. We print 300 copies and distribute them everywhere. Millhaven, Denver, Colorado Springs, every newspaper and federal office within 100 miles. We make it impossible for them to suppress the truth." Sarah nodded slowly. "But that still leaves the question of the meeting with Judge Morrison's clerk." "I'll go," Tommy said immediately. "No." The firmness in Sarah's voice surprised them both. "You've been hiding for 20 years, Tommy. If this goes wrong, if it's a trap, they'll kill you on sight. But me, I'm already supposed to be dead. I'm the ghost they've been trying to forget. Sarah, besides, I have something they want." She picked up the silver locket, letting it catch the lamplight. "This locket appearing after all these years has them spooked. They know someone dug up my daughter's grave, someone who knows the truth about what happened. They'll want to know who." Elias could see the logic in her reasoning, but the thought of sending her alone to what might be an ambush made his chest tight with anxiety. "If you're going to do this, you're not going alone." The note said to come alone. The note was written by someone we don't know and can't trust. If he's legitimate, he'll understand the precaution. If he's not, then having backup might be the difference between justice and 3 more bodies in unmarked graves. Sarah looked at them both for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but we do this carefully. Elias, you take a position where you can cover the church without being seen. Tommy, you stay here and keep printing handbills. If Elias and I don't come back by sunrise, you get those papers to every newspaper between here and Washington, D.C. Sarah, none of us like it. But we're out of time and out of options." She slung the rifle over her shoulder and tucked the locket into her shirt pocket. 20 years ago they thought they'd silence me forever. Tonight they're going to learn how wrong they were. The old church sat at the edge of Millhaven, its steeple dark against the star-filled sky. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the new church was built closer to the center of town, and its windows were boarded up against weather and vandals. Elias positioned himself in the bell tower of the new church, 3 blocks away, but with a clear view of the old building. Through his field glasses, he could see the shadows around the abandoned structure. Looking for signs of an ambush, at 11:30, a single figure approached the old church on foot, a young Chinese man in a dark suit, carrying what looked like a leather satchel. David Chen, presumably, arriving early for the midnight meeting. At 11:45, Sarah appeared at the edge of the churchyard, moving carefully from shadow to shadow as she approached the building. Even at this distance, Elias could see the tension in her movements, the way she held her rifle ready for instant use. She reached the church door and knocked, 3 slow knocks, then 2 quick ones, then 3 slow again. The door opened, and she disappeared inside. Elias kept his glasses trained on the building, watching for any sign of trouble. Minutes passed with no movement, no sounds, no indication of what might be happening inside. Then, at 5 minutes past midnight, he saw them, dark figures moving through the trees behind the church. At least 6 men, possibly more, all carrying rifles and moving with military precision. They surrounded the building quickly and efficiently, cutting off all escape routes. Elias was already moving, abandoning his position in the bell tower and running through the dark streets toward the old church. But he was 3 blocks away, and even running at full speed, he wouldn't arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the old church, multiple rifles firing in rapid succession, the sharp cracks echoing off the buildings of the sleeping town. Then abruptly, silence. By the time Elias reached the churchyard, it was over. The door of the old church stood open, lamplight spilling out into the darkness. Inside, he could see overturned chairs, scattered papers, and what looked like bullet holes in the wooden walls. But no bodies, no blood, no sign of Sarah or David Chen. On the floor near the altar, he found a single silver locket, its chain broken as if it had been torn from someone's neck in a struggle, and beside it, a note written in unfamiliar handwriting. "If you want to see her again, Bring all the evidence to the Silver Creek mine at dawn. Come alone, or she dies. Elias picked up the locket, his hands shaking with rage and fear. They had Sarah. After 20 years of hiding, after finally finding the courage to fight back, she'd walked into exactly the trap he'd feared. But as he turned to leave the church, he noticed something else. Scattered pages from what looked like official court documents, stamped with territorial seals and covered with legal writing. David Chen's satchel had been torn open during the struggle, and its contents had spilled across the floor. Elias gathered up the papers quickly, not taking time to read them in detail, but recognizing their official nature. Whatever David Chen had brought to the meeting, it was apparently important enough that the conspirators hadn't been able to clean up everything in their haste to escape. As he stuffed the documents into his coat, one page caught his eye. A territorial warrant, signed by a federal judge in Denver, authorizing the arrest of Judge Morrison, Sheriff Blake, and 12 other named individuals on charges of conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. The warrant was dated 3 days ago. David Chen hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been a federal agent working undercover to gather evidence for a coordinated sweep of the criminal organization, which meant Sarah hadn't walked into a trap set by local corrupt officials. She'd walked into the middle of a federal investigation that was about to explode into the open, with or without their help. The ride to Silver Creek Mine took Elias through terrain he'd never seen before. The approach from the valley floor, rather than the mountain heights where Sarah had spent her exile. In the pre-dawn darkness, the mining operation looked like something from a fever dream. Massive wooden structures silhouetted against the starlit sky, the skeletal framework of the stamp mill rising like the bones of some prehistoric beast. Elias had left Tommy in the cave with explicit instructions. If he wasn't back by noon, assume the worst and get the evidence to the federal authorities. The young man had wanted to come along, but Elias had been firm. Too many people had already died because of this conspiracy. He wouldn't be responsible for adding Tommy Barkley to that list. The mine's main gate stood open, which told Elias everything he needed to know about the trap he was walking into. No legitimate mining operation left its gates unguarded in the middle of the night. They wanted him to come in, wanted him to find whatever they had prepared for him. He dismounted Judge 50 yards from the gate and approached on foot, his rifle ready and his senses alert for any sign of movement. The mine was supposed to be deserted at this hour, but lamplight flickered in several of the buildings, and he could smell wood smoke on the night air. "Cross!" a voice called from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "That you out there?" "I'm here," he called back. "Where's Sarah?" "Safe and sound. For now." The voice seemed to come from the direction of the main office building. "You bring what we asked for?" "I brought it. Let me see her first." "You're not in a position to make demands, Cross, but we're reasonable men. Come to the office building, slow and easy." Elias walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel that surrounded the mining structures. As he drew closer, he could see armed men positioned around the buildings, at least a dozen of them, all with rifles trained on his approach. The office building was a 2-story structure built of imported lumber, more substantial than the rough mining shacks that surrounded it. Light glowed in the ground floor windows, and the door stood slightly ajar. "That's far enough." The voice came from directly ahead now. "Set your rifle down and put your hands where we can see them." Elias complied, placing his Winchester carefully on the ground and raising his hands. Immediately, 4 men stepped out of the shadows, all pointing guns at him. "Search him," one of them ordered. Rough hands patted him down, removing his pistol, his knife, and the folded papers he'd taken from the church. One of the men, Elias, recognized him as Sheriff Blake, despite the darkness, examined the documents by lamplight. Well, looks like our retired lawman has been busy." Blake's voice carried a satisfaction that made Elias's skin crawl. "Federal warrants, territorial court orders, witness statements. Very impressive. Where's Sarah?" "All in good time. First we need to discuss your situation." Blake nodded to his men, who prodded Elias toward the office building with their rifle barrels. Inside, the office was surprisingly well appointed for a mining operation. Polished wood furniture, oil paintings on the walls, a massive safe in one corner. Seated behind the largest desk was Judge Morrison, still wearing his formal black robes as if he'd come directly from court. "Sheriff Cross," the judge said pleasantly. "Or should I say former Sheriff Cross? Please, have a seat. I'll stand." "Where's Sarah Whitmore?" "Mrs. Whitmore is indisposed at the moment, but she's quite safe, I assure you." Morrison gestured to a chair placed directly in front of his desk. "Please, we have much to discuss." When Elias remained standing, two of the armed men forced him into the chair. Sheriff Blake took a position behind him, close enough to put a gun to his head if necessary. 20 years, Judge Morrison said, shaking his head sadly. 20 years we've kept this community safe, prosperous, and peaceful. 20 years of progress, of growth, of bringing civilization to this wilderness. And now, just as we're preparing to retire and enjoy the fruits of our labor, you show up with your questions and your investigations. Your 20 years of progress were built on murder, were they? Or were they built on difficult decisions, made by men with the courage to do what was necessary? Morrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Sheriff, in your 37 years of law enforcement, did you never encounter a situation where the greater good required flexibility in the application of justice?" "I never murdered innocent people for profit." "Innocent?" Morrison laughed. "Marcus Whitmore was a drunk who beat his wife and neglected his child. The Henderson widow was a miser who hoarded wealth while her neighbors struggled. The banker's wife was an adulteress who was bleeding the bank dry with her extravagances. These were not pillars of the community, Sheriff. They were obstacles to progress. And the little girl, Mary Catherine Whitmore, what was her crime?" For the first time, Morrison's expression faltered slightly. "Regrettable. Children sometimes suffer for the sins of their parents. But she would have grown up poor and neglected anyway. In many ways, we spared her a life of misery." Elias felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What do you want from me?" "Simple. Your silence, and your cooperation in tying up a few loose ends." Morrison nodded toward Sheriff Blake. "We know about the evidence you and Mrs. Whitmore have been gathering. We know about young Tommy Barkley's survival. We know about the printing press hidden in that cave. Then you know it's too late. The evidence is already out there." "Is it? Are you certain of that?" Morrison smiled. "Sheriff Blake's men have been very busy tonight. They visited your cave, collected all the printed materials, arrested Mr. Barkley, and secured all the documents you thought were so damaging." Elias's heart sank. If they had Tommy, if they had destroyed the evidence. "Don't look so glum, Sheriff. You can still save lives. Mrs. Whitmore's life, for instance, and Mr. Barkley's, even your own." Morrison opened a desk drawer and withdrew a prepared document. "All you have to do is sign this confession." "What kind of confession?" "A very simple one. You admit that you and your accomplices have been blackmailing prominent citizens of Millhaven with forged documents and fabricated evidence. You admit that when your scheme was discovered, you murdered David Chen to prevent him from exposing you. You admit that Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Barkley were innocent dupes who got caught up in your criminal enterprise. And then we arrange for you to have a tragic accident while attempting to escape justice. Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Barkley overcome. With remorse for their part in your scheme, take their own lives out of shame. Very sad, but these things happen." Morrison slid the confession across the desk. "Of course, if you refuse to sign, we'll simply kill all three of you tonight and claim you were killed while resisting arrest. Either way, the problem gets solved." Elias stared at the document, his mind racing. They had him completely outmaneuvered, trapped, disarmed, with his friends' lives hanging in the balance. But something about the judge's manner bothered him. The man was too confident, too satisfied with his position. "One question?" Elias said. "Certainly. If you've captured Tommy and destroyed all the evidence, why do you need me to sign anything? Why not just kill us all and be done with it?" Morrison's smile never wavered, but Elias caught a flicker of something else in his eyes. "Uncertainty, perhaps, or fear. Because we're civilized men, Sheriff. We prefer legal solutions to our problems. That was when Elias knew they were lying about something. Maybe they hadn't captured Tommy. Maybe they hadn't found all the evidence. Maybe the federal investigation was closer than they realized. "I need to see Sarah first," he said. "I need to know she's alive before I sign anything." Judge Morrison's hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough to confirm Elias's suspicions. They were bluffing about something. Tommy the evidence, or maybe both. "Very well," Morrison said finally. "Sheriff Blake, escort our guest to the mine shaft. Let him see Mrs. Whitmore, but make it brief." Blake prodded Elias to his feet and marched him outside, flanked by 2 armed men. They walked through the mining complex toward the main shaft, a dark opening in the mountainside, surrounded by heavy timber supports and mining equipment. As they approached, Elias could see a figure seated on a wooden crate near the shaft entrance, hands bound behind her back. Even in the dim lamplight, he recognized Sarah's silhouette. "Sarah!" he called. She looked up, and even at this distance he could see the relief in her eyes. "Elias, are you hurt?" "I'm fine. What about you?" "I've been better, but I'm alive." Sheriff Blake stepped between them. "Touching reunion. Now you've seen her. Time to go back and sign that confession." But as they turned to leave, Elias heard something that made his blood freeze. A woman's scream, high and terrified, echoing from somewhere deep within the mine shaft. What was that? "Nothing that concerns you," Blake said quickly. The scream came again, closer this time, and Elias realized it wasn't Sarah screaming. Someone else was in that mine. Someone who was in trouble. "Tommy?" Sarah called into the darkness. "Tommy, is that you?" "Shut up." Blake struck her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling. "Not another word." That was when Elias saw his chance. Blake had turned his attention to Sarah, and the other 2 men were looking toward the mine shaft, distracted by whatever was happening down there. Elias launched himself at the nearest guard, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection and sending them both tumbling to the ground. Sarah! "The shaft!" She understood immediately, rolling away from Blake and scrambling toward the mine entrance, despite her bound hands. Elias grappled with the guard for his rifle, fighting for control of the weapon as the second guard tried to get a clear shot. The rifle went off, the bullet going wide and sparking off the rocky wall of the mine shaft. In the brief muzzle flash, Elias saw something that made his heart leap with hope. Tommy Barkley emerging from the depths of the mine, carrying someone over his shoulder. "He's got the federal agent," Blake shouted. "Stop him!" Tommy stumbled into the lamplight, David Chen's unconscious form draped across his back. The young federal agent was alive but barely conscious, blood matting his black hair where someone had struck him. "Tommy!" Sarah called. "The evidence. Safe." Tommy gasped, lowering Chen to the ground. "All of it. Multiple copies." That's when the shooting started in earnest. Blake and his men opened fire on Tommy's position, bullets ricocheting off mining equipment and sending sparks flying in all directions. Tommy dove for cover behind an ore cart, pulling the wounded federal agent with him. Elias finally succeeded in wresting the rifle away from the guard he'd been fighting with, using the weapon's stock to club the man unconscious. He rolled behind a pile of timber supports just as Blake's bullets chewed splinters from the wood above his head. "Cross!" Blake shouted over the gunfire. "Give it up!" "You're outnumbered." "Maybe," Elias called back. "But you're not the only one with reinforcements coming." Even as he said it, he could hear the sound he'd been hoping for. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, approaching the mine at full gallop. Tommy must have gotten word to someone before his capture, or maybe the federal investigation had been closer to moving than anyone realized. Blake heard it too. "Damn it, Morrison said we had more time." Morrison lied about a lot of things. Tommy called from his position behind the ore cart, including how much evidence the federal government already has. The hoofbeats grew closer, and Elias could see torchlight moving through the darkness beyond the mine's entrance. A lot of torches, which meant a lot of riders. "Blake." A new voice boomed across the mining complex. "Federal Marshal Thompson, you and your men are surrounded. Lay down your weapons." "Go to hell." Blake screamed back, firing wildly in the direction of the approaching lawman. That's when everything went wrong for the conspirators at once. Federal agents poured into the mining complex from 3 directions, their weapons and badges clearly visible in the torchlight. Judge Morrison appeared in the doorway of the office building, took one look at the situation, and immediately raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," Morrison called. "I surrender. I was coerced. These men threaten my family." "You lying bastard." Blake turned his rifle on the judge, but before he could pull the trigger, Elias's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The remaining guards, seeing their leader down and federal agents closing in from all sides, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. As the federal marshals secured the prisoners, Elias ran to where Sarah still sat near the mine shaft, her hands still bound behind her back. He cut her free with a knife borrowed from one of the marshals, and she immediately threw her arms around him. "I thought they were going to kill you," she whispered against his chest. "They tried. But it seems we had more friends than we knew about." Tommy approached, supporting the wounded David Chen. The federal agent was conscious now, though still obviously in pain. "Agent Chen," Marshal Thompson said, taking charge of the scene. "Good to see you alive. We lost contact with you 3 days ago." "I'm fine, sir. Thanks to Mr. Barkley here." Chen looked at Tommy with genuine gratitude. "He pulled me out of that mine shaft after they dumped me down there to die. How did you know to come here?" Sarah asked. Marshal Thompson smiled. "Anonymous tip. Someone left detailed information at our Denver office, along with copies of every document you've been collecting. Whoever it was made sure we knew exactly when and where to find the evidence we needed." Elias looked at Tommy, who shrugged innocently. "I may have made a trip to Denver last week, just to make sure all the right people knew what was happening up here. You've been busy. 20 years is a long time to prepare for one night," Tommy replied. "I wanted to make sure we got it right." As the federal agents led Judge Morrison and the surviving conspirators away in shackles, Sarah picked up her mother's wedding ring from where she'd hidden it in her pocket during the captivity. The simple gold band caught the torchlight as she slipped it onto her finger. "It's over," she said softly. "After 20 years, it's finally over." But Elias could see in her eyes that it wasn't really over. Not yet. The conspirators were captured, the evidence was secure, and justice would be served. But Sarah still had ghosts to lay to rest, a life to rebuild, and a future to decide. And if he was reading the look in her eyes correctly, she wanted him to be part of that future. 6 months later, the mountain meadow where Sarah had once lived in exile had been transformed into something entirely different. A place of celebration rather than sorrow, of community rather than isolation. The new cabin Sarah and Elias had built together sat in the same clearing where her old home had burned. But it was larger, warmer, designed for 2 people who intended to share their lives rather than hide from the world. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, and lamplight glowed golden in the windows as the last light of autumn faded from the western sky. Inside, Sarah stood before the mirror that had belonged to her mother, adjusting the ivory silk wedding dress she'd kept hidden for so many years. The dress still fit perfectly, and despite everything she'd endured, she looked radiant in the soft light of the oil lamps. "You ready?" Tommy called from the main room, where he'd been helping arrange furniture and decorations for the small ceremony that would take place in an hour. "Almost," Sarah replied, fastening the silver locket around her neck. Mary Catherine's picture smiled up at her from the tiny daguerreotype, and for the first time in 23 years, the sight brought her joy rather than pain. She'd visited her daughter's grave the week before, bringing fresh flowers and the news that justice had finally been served. The men who'd killed Marcus and Mary Catherine were now serving life sentences in the territorial prison, and the Silver Creek mine had been shuttered permanently, its stolen wealth distributed among the families of the victims. "Sarah." Elias's voice came from outside the cabin. May I come in?" "Not yet," she called back. smiling at the tradition they were observing, even though this was hardly a conventional wedding. "Bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony. Then I'll wait out here with the other guests." Through the window, Sarah could see the small gathering of people who'd come to witness their wedding. Dr. Brennan's replacement, a young physician from Denver who'd proven himself trustworthy over the past months. Mrs. Kowalski from the general store, who'd been among the first to apologize once the truth came out. Several of the miners who'd worked the legitimate claims in the area. Men who'd had no part in the conspiracy but had lost friends to its violence. And most importantly, David Chen, the federal agent who'd nearly died in the conspiracy's final desperate gambit. He'd recovered fully from his injuries and had become a close friend to all three of them, bonding over their shared experience of fighting corruption and seeking justice. "Sarah," Tommy knocked on the bedroom door. "I have something for you." She opened the door to find him holding a small wooden box, carefully carved and polished to a warm honey color. "What is it?" "Wedding present. From both Elias and me." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring, sized to match the one she already wore on her right hand. "Elias made it himself from gold we panned from the creek. He wanted you to have something new to go with something old." Sarah picked up the ring, feeling its weight and warmth. Around the band, Elias had engraved a pattern of intertwined flowers, mountain laurel and columbine, the wild flowers that grew in abundance around their new home. "It's beautiful. He's a good man." "Sarah, different from Marcus, but good in his own way." Tommy's voice was serious. "He loves you. Really loves you, not just the idea of you or what you might become. He loves the woman who survived 20 years in these mountains, who fought back when it would have been easier to give up." "I know." Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger beside her mother's band. "I love him too. It took me a while to believe I deserved that kind of happiness again, but I do believe it now." "Good, because you do deserve it. You deserve all the happiness this world has to offer." Outside, she could hear the sound of voices, their guests gathering around the small altar Tommy had built from mountain stone and pine logs. David Chen would officiate, using the authority granted to him as a federal agent to perform the ceremony. Sarah picked up her mother's Bible, the same one that had survived the fire 20 years earlier, now rebound in new leather but still containing the family records that had helped prove their case. She would carry it as her something old, along with the locket that had started everything. "Ready?" Tommy offered her his arm. "Ready." They walked outside together into the crisp mountain air. The meadow was lit by dozens of lanterns, hung from the surrounding pine trees, creating a circle of warm light in the darkness. Elias stood waiting at the altar, wearing his best suit and the silver badge that had been returned to him by the territorial governor. Not his old badge, but a new one marking his appointment as a special federal marshal. As Sarah walked toward him, she saw in his eyes the same look she'd seen that first night when he'd climbed the mountain trail to return her daughter's locket. Patience, determination, and a kind of quiet strength that she'd learned to depend upon. The ceremony was simple and brief, but every word carried weight. When David Chen pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered witnesses cheered, and Tommy fired his rifle into the air in celebration. But it was the quiet moment afterward, when Sarah and Elias stood together on the cabin's front porch, watching their guests celebrate. That meant the most to both of them. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Only that it took 20 years to find you." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling a contentment she hadn't experienced since before Marcus and Mary Catherine died. "What about you? Any second thoughts about marrying the infamous mountain woman?" "None whatsoever. Though I have to say, you're going to have to find a new reputation. The sheriff's wife doesn't have quite the same ring of mystery." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the meadow and echoing off the mountain walls. For 20 years, these mountains had been her prison. Now they were her home, a place where she and Elias could build a life together, where the past had been laid to rest and the future stretched out bright with possibility. The silver locket at her throat caught the lantern light, and Mary Catherine's sweet face smiled up at her from the tiny photograph. Justice had been served, love had conquered fear, and the mountain woman had finally found her way home. In the distance, an owl called from the dark forest, its voice no longer lonely, but welcoming, a benediction on this new beginning. This second chance at happiness that had been so long in coming and was now finally truly theirs.